You know, this seems like a sort of an easy idea, right? We have to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions until you, all of us individually, until you apply it, right? So for 30 years, I commuted on bike because I had a pretty easy commute, just a couple miles each way, just down this one street. It was great. When I retired, and I had just one car between the two of us, my wife and I. And I backslid. And I got a second car because I needed to go places. And I made that decision. And my son, who is an environmental economist, he's very much committed to these things and works in the field. When I told him that, he was just so mad. And he called me up and he said, here's the company. You have to buy $150 worth of carbon offsets today, or I won't be talking to you. So we'll see which of these policies make most sense to you and me and all of us, and we'll see where we go from there. And it is great. I am very happy to be part of this in Sustainable Path because it's a fascinating organization. And the idea of us coming together, pooling our resources to promote groups that are working, I guess long before Kickstarter, you guys were pooling your resources, and it's a great thing. All right, so our four panelists are going to talk. They're going to present their ideas, and then we will have a round robin of question and answer, and then we will go out into the audience, and you guys will have questions as well to put to them. Casey Golden starts us out. He shapes policy and communication strategies at Climate Solutions with the goal of changing what's possible so we can do what's necessary. Cynicism, he insists, is capitulation. I was in Selma last week on this amazing civil rights pilgrimage, meeting all the great people who were the heroes of that era that are still alive, the foot soldiers. None of them are cynical. Every one of them say that you have to be positive and you have to make the next step and commit yourself. And as a matter of fact, one of the main foot soldiers said, climate change is the most important issue now. It's wrapped with race, it's wrapped with poverty, but it is the way we have to address all these things. So I thought that was pretty amazing. Casey has served as Special Assistant to the Mayor of Seattle for Clean Energy and Climate Protection Initiatives, Director of Washington State's Energy Policy Office, been active in the utility industry, helping Seattle City Light become the first major carbon-free electric utility in the late 90s, and as a governor's representative to the Executive Board of Energy Northwest, a regional public power consortium. He's also board chair of 350.org, which most of you must know what that is, but if you haven't, it's always worth checking out. And he helped my son do some work when he was still in college. He got to do an internship. So I've interviewed some of these folks, so I know them. I know their tricks. Casey?
Well, and I don't even have anything to be cynical about compared to what they went through, right? Wow. Thank you, Steve and Nan and Lee and everyone for putting this on. You know, this is kind of like a dream come true to all of a sudden have everybody want to invite, for people like us to have people want to sit down for an evening and wonk out on climate policy, and then which we did at the University of Washington in January, and then like it enough to actually ask us back to do it again. We've been waiting a long time for this moment. I want to, before we get into a night that will be filled with, good discussion about pros and cons of different policies, I want to set the stage a little bit and talk about the context and the problem we're trying to solve. And I want to start by just throwing a little question mark around the title of our panel, which is something about pricing carbon. Because really what we're about here, you think pricing carbon, it might suggest, well, what these people want is for us to pay more for fossil fuels. And of course, what we're about is exactly the opposite. The problem we're trying to solve is that we're paying way too much right now for fossil fuels, not just at the pump in our utility bills, but in the mounting and escalating impacts of climate change. And what we're really about is accelerating the clean energy revolution, the transition from the fossil fuel age to the clean energy age, that is the only real solution to that problem at scale. In fact, that is the exact opposite of paying more for fossil fuels. it's freeing ourselves of fossil fuels so we can pay less and enjoy a healthy future. I think that's really important to keep in mind as we begin to design policy. Now I'm going to spend just a little bit on this. I'm going to issue you this warning. It is, after all, a climate evening. This comes with the territory. There's only going to be a little of it. We're going to get through it really quick, and you have to promise not to retreat because we got a lot of work to do before the night's over, so just sit up tall and take it on the chin for just 1 second with me. Here is the objective reality of our circumstances on the planet, according to the IPCC, the most exhaustively peer-reviewed scientific consensus in the history of science. On the left, you have the planet that we get if we successfully and quickly engineer the transition from fossil fuels to clean energy. The temperature increases on that planet and the effects of those temperature increases will be very significant. We won't get off scot-free no matter what. But that planet will still be recognizable. We will still know that planet as the one and only home that we have in this universe, and we can still call it Earth. The planet on the right, on the other hand, is the planet that we get with what the economists call business as usual, which is fossil fuel dependence as usual, continuing to expand in the future if we don't do something different than what we're doing. That planet would be so violently transformed by human suffering and catastrophic physical impacts that we would have to give it a new name. Let's call that one Planet Toast. I am not going to go through the long litany of physical consequences that we can expect on Planet Toast. I'll spare you that, but if you get me riled up, I will, so just give fair warning. But I will say that, I think the most important thing to say about it is that's not an environmental thing. I mean, look at that. That's are we going to have food? Are we going to have water? That's a survival thing. It's a human health thing, and above all, it's a justice thing. Because the people who are doing the least to cause that are the people who are suffering now and will suffer the worst of the impacts. It is the ultimate human injustice, and we got to fix it. If all of that is looking a little not only sad but abstract to you, it's not in Vanuatu, which was pretty much wiped out by a Category 5 storm this weekend. Now you can have lots of little, clever debates about the attribution of specific events, but what's very clear is we are now knowingly creating the terms and conditions for lots more of this and all of the human suffering that goes on under that satellite picture. We got to cut that out. Can't do that anymore. Second reason why we got to do this is our prospective new neighbor here, the Polar Pioneer, which the Port of Seattle has invited onto our waterfront. They have issued a lease to be the home port for the Arctic drilling fleet. We think that's it. We're not sure, actually, because we don't have all the documents yet, but we think that's the successor to the Culloch. And many of us, and I'm sure some of you were there, went down to the port and said, hey, I got a problem with that because that sort of looks like how the world ends, and I sort of thought we were doing something different in Seattle than that. And the port commissioners kind of looked at us and said, well, that's kind of above my pay grade. I mean, that's whatever you're talking about, that's a global thing. Let the global people deal with that, right? Well, of course, that's not going to work because this decision is now in front of us in our community, and we have the choice to aid and abet it and take a cut of the action or do the right thing and try to turn it around. So we're going to have that fight. But the port commissioners were right in a way in saying it really shouldn't have to be on them to make a call about turning this back because it's inconsistent with a safe global climate. We should have a functional United States Congress, and the Koch brothers shouldn't be buying our election. This is true. I mean, seriously, right? We should be doing this the right way, and challenging a lease decision is obviously not the most efficient or effective way to save the planet from global climate change. It happens to be what we have to do because we failed to do the right thing so far and get a good, strong climate policy in place. And when we do, no one will be talking about Arctic drilling, and we won't have to have these kind of fights. In the meantime, we do. And so that's the second reason, because I think we can win this fight, but we need to start having fewer of them and have a coherent policy that avoids them in the first place. So that's why we got to do it. Now, at the risk of saying the single most obvious thing that can be said about climate change, it is indeed a big problem. It is not fundamentally that complicated, though, and my animations are a little out of order here. It's two things. It's stop making it worse. It's stop with fossil fuel dependence or growing fossil fuel dependence as usual, and wage and win a clean energy revolution. We can do both of those things, but I'm so bullish and pumped up about the clean energy revolution part that I'm going to start with number 2 first. Now, you would expect for me to stand up here and wave my arms about the clean energy revolution, but this is the title of a report that came out a couple years ago now from those crazy Bolsheviks at the United States Department of Energy. And they outlined the progress, the recent progress in the cost and availability of some key clean energy technologies. I'm going to run through them quickly. Here's solar. The blue bars are solar costs coming down. The green curve, which I like to think of as the arc of the solar universe, going rapidly up, and even more rapidly since 2012. Costs down, deployment up, same story with wind over a little bit longer period of time, but very encouraging trends. Same with LED lights. Same with electric vehicles and batteries, which will really be a game-changing kind of system change technology when we really get the energy storage to the point where it needs to be economically. This clean energy revolution is on. I mean, in a way that I've been doing this a long time, but the last 5 years are really exciting in terms of the availability and cost of this stuff. So cool. We've now established that we have to do it. We've now at least given you some hint that we can do it, and I'd be happy to talk more about why I think we can in Q&A. The problem is, and bear with me, this takes a little explaining, but it's worth it. Basically all climate graphs start with these two lines. Here's the business, they call this business as usual, and they call this, the stabilization trajectory. So business as usual, as we know, leads to toast. Stabilization trajectory gives us a shot at something that looks like Earth. And what you see on this slide is that we are in imminent danger of being locked into an emission scenario, economically locked in to an emission scenario that sends us past our safe carbon budget, if you think 2 degrees is safe, and we can argue about that too. But what this shows is all the things that are going to produce all those blue and now the purple emissions, that's already been built. We've already paid the tab for that. That's very hard to get out of. And within 2 years, we'll have done all the emissions that get us all the way to the 2-degree line. So what's the bottom line of that? Stop making it worse. It's the first rule for getting out of holes. It's not that complicated. We know how to do that. We can't effectuate solutions and continue to make the problem worse at the same time. It doesn't make sense, it costs too much, and we've run out of time for it. This is the real significance of the Keystone Pipeline fight in my mind. Not that the pipeline itself isn't significant, it is, but the underlying principle that's so important is we have to stop making these new commitments, long-term, capital-intensive commitments that lock us into dangerous climate change. We say stop making it worse. How practical is that? Because I made it worse when I drove here today, right? Or when you go to the store, or just living our lives makes it worse. No, that's a different kind of making it worse. That's what we do. All that stuff is already accounted for in here. That's what we do within our existing infrastructure and emissions footprint. What we're talking about is the big, new, capital-intensive mistakes that drive us over into dangerous territory. Okay, so now that we know what we have to do, let's put it all together and come up with a game plan, which, of course, you do by drawing another emissions graph, right? So here's our business as usual line. Here's our stabilization line. The first thing to recognize is business as usual is a fiction. It's an economist's statistical abstraction of what happens if we're completely stupid and we don't respond to any of the information we now have. And it's physically impossible. You can't keep burning that much more fossil fuels before every place starts looking like Vanuatu. But B, it's insulting in a way to think that business as usual means continuing to make out into the future all these fatal mistakes that we now know are fatal. We're not that stupid. We don't have to do that. So let's have a new and morally improved business as usual. That's the Keystone Principle that simply says we're going to stop making it worse because we've got a lot of work to do to make it better. We're going to say a firm and unyielding no to the Keystones and the Arctic drillings and the coal export, the things that make it impossible to solve the problem, that make it irrevocably, intractably worse. Because we need to hold open that space for solutions. And then we're going to fill that space with all the cool things that I'd love to talk about more that were on those graphs and transit and all the good things that make for sustainable prosperity and emission reduction. So, what's the hang up? I mean, there it all is on the PowerPoint graph, right? What are we waiting for? How come this isn't already happening? Well, there's two key things missing from a policy perspective. First thing that's missing is a real commitment to actually get the job done, right? I mean, it's nice that we had that line on the graph that says stabilization, and it's nice that the scientists told us that that's where the line for our carbon budget is, but now we need to act as citizens and make a real commitment to actually do it. That's a limit, that's a cap on emissions. We need to say that we're serious about doing the job. That's what the energy markets need to hear in order to invest confidently. They need a commitment they can take to the bank. That's what other countries need to hear, because this is all about trust and mutual cooperation. And to be honest, the United States has quite a bit of work to rebuild the world's trust in our willingness to live up to our commitments and to get this done. And it's what our kids need to hear so that they don't ultimately find us in breach of the intergenerational contract. So we need to say that. We need to make this the law. We need a limit. And the second problem is, and now we get into some seriously funky PowerPoint graphics, we have a strong economic wind blowing in the wrong direction in the form of unpriced carbon. And when we say unpriced carbon, it doesn't mean it's cost-free, right? Vanuatu's paying the cost right now. What we mean is that cost is not incorporated in the price that we actually pay for the carbon-based fuels. So the economists call this an externality, a market failure. If we're going to live in a market society and we're going to solve this problem, we can't have all our solutions sailing into this stiff economic headwind, this subsidy for making it worse. We have to turn that round with a fair price on carbon that actually starts to tell the truth about the real costs of carbon. And that will be wind in the sails of all the rest of our solutions. It'll make everything else we do to solve the problem cheaper and work better. Those are the two foundations, I think, for a really strong climate policy in a market society. And those are the things that we now turn ourselves toward. We're going to talk about both. This is the progress of them around the world. The green areas are places where there's a cap and an emission market in place already. The blue areas are the places where there's a carbon tax. There's a few that have both. There's a bunch of the orange areas that are considering one or the other. About 22% we think of the world's emissions are now under some form of carbon price or cap, price or cap. As much as 50% by 2016 when China's program really gets going. So this is making progress around the world. And in our state, the legislature is now considering the Carbon Pollution Accountability Act, which would be both a limit and a price on carbon. It includes that critical element, and I emphasize this again because some of the things we'll talk about tonight, while they have policy merits, do not include that critical element of a real commitment to get the job done. It would end free carbon dumping. It would start to turn that economic wind back in the right direction by auctioning the pollution allowances instead of giving them away for free. And that would raise revenue, and we'll talk a lot probably tonight about what to do with that revenue. But our principle at Climate Solutions is, we'd love to see the revenue invested in solutions, because we should all, again, this isn't about paying more for carbon-based fuels, it's about having better options, and some of those options require public investment. So that's our preference. We'd like to see a lot of that, and we'd like to see solutions be available to everyone regardless of income. But we understand that investments and revenues become a very sort of politically complicated thing. And our baseline principle in navigating those politics is it has to be equitable, whatever we do with that money. The problem itself is inequitable enough. The solution can't be inequitable. We have to invest in things that promote equity. In the package in the legislature, the investments include a big chunk for the working families tax credit, which currently exists but is unfunded. The big education hole in the budget, of course, there's a bunch allocated to that, and also for clean transportation options so people have better options. We'll talk about other ways to do this. There are other ways to do this. This isn't perfect from my perspective. Todd and Yoram to some extent will sort of argue about why there's a better idea and a different way to go that makes more sense politically or from a policy perspective. I'm not going to sort of get into that at this point. I'm going to finish, but you can ask me about it if you want. But what I do want to say is we can have good-spirited arguments about what's really going to work and what we ought to do going forward, but we all ought to recognize that anything that's actually going to get the job done is going to dramatically reduce fossil fuel dependence. There is an extremely powerful constituency against dramatically reducing fossil fuel dependence. This is a headline from Danny Westneath's column from, I think, a week ago Saturday, where he said that, and he was referring to this bill that the state Senate is doing its oily best to ignore us. A poll came out in the central Puget Sound showing really quite overwhelming support for this concept recently, and Danny was saying, how come people like it so much, but the state Senate doesn't seem to? And the truth is, it's not about this particular policy design. Anything that gets the job done on climate is going to leave a whole bunch of carbon in the ground. And if your business model depends on getting the carbon out of the ground and into the atmosphere, you're not going to like that. So all of this stuff faces stiff opposition from the concentrated economic and political power of the fossil fuel industry. And to win on any of this stuff, we're going to have to overcome that, whether it's at the legislature, whether it's at the ballot, where you've seen how these ballot initiatives play out when the money starts rolling in. The fossil fuel industry has an outsized share of power. It irrigates other people's power. It makes other people think that we don't have any option but to depend on them. We have to separate ourselves from that power cycle and overcome it in order to get any of these great policy ideas done. Thank you very much.
Yoram Bauman says he's the world's first and only stand-up economist. But you know, I read economic columnists, and I think they're all pretty funny. PhD in environmental he has a PhD in environmental economics, must be. Part of Carbon Washington, the effort to bring revenue-neutral carbon tax to Washington State. Co-author of The Cartoon Introduction to Climate Change, and the 2-volume cartoon Introduction to Economics. Has anybody seen that? Yeah, it's a lot of fun. And you learn something from it. 1998, Tax Shift. That book was written with Alan Durning of Sightline Institute, helped inspire the revenue-neutral carbon tax in British Columbia. And Yoram is here to talk about that same idea in Washington State.
Thank you all for coming out tonight. So I want to start by telling you about what many economists consider to be the best climate policy in the world, actually passed by a right-of-center government in British Columbia that said, look, we want to do something about climate change, we want to be market-friendly, we don't want to grow government, so they implemented a revenue-neutral carbon tax. So all the money that comes in from the carbon tax is used to reduce personal and corporate income taxes in the province of British Columbia. So yes, they pay 30 cents a gallon more for gasoline in British Columbia, but they have the lowest personal income taxes in Canada, the lowest corporate income taxes in the G8 group of rich democracies. Both political parties in BC now accept the policy, which is terrific, and the policy has been in place since 2008, and we can actually see how it's been working. So first of all, we can look at carbon emissions. So this is petroleum sales. BC is in green, Canada as a whole is in blue. The drop at the beginning is because of the financial crisis, but you can see that BC has had, both in absolute terms and relative to Canada as a whole, significant reductions in carbon emissions. My title for this slide is Economics Works. When you make something more expensive, people buy less of it. We can look at what's happened with the economy of British Columbia. Here's the economy of BC, which is doing just as well as the economy of Canada as a whole. So really, I would argue a terrific success story. They're cutting emissions, the economy is doing fine, a policy that lots of folks all around the world would do well to emulate. There is some distinction, as many of you know, between kind of the carbon tax folks and the cap and trade folks. As an economist, I can tell you that the similarities between those policies, at least in theory, the similarities between those policies are much stronger than the differences between them. And it's really a matter of comparing those types of policies, which economists both consider to be economic instruments, with other types of more heavy-handed command and control style regulatory policies. Having said that, I will give you a little bit of my only joke of the evening, unfortunately, is my comparison of the BC carbon tax with the California cap and trade system. One of the reasons why I love the BC carbon tax is that you can actually describe it in a haiku. So here's my haiku. I'll count the syllables out for you. So it's fossil CO2, $30 for each ton, revenue neutral. And that's basically the whole policy. Right? Now, the California cap and trade system is, I would argue, a little bit more like War and Peace. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's bad, right? War and Peace is generally recognized as one of the best novels ever written, but it is more complicated. Okay? As you know, and as Casey mentioned, there's a cap and trade bill that the governor's introduced down in Olympia, and I want to describe the position of this Carbon Washington group that I'm part of relative to that and the metaphor that I want to use, the analogy is that Carbon Washington is like the relief pitcher. Okay? So you have the starting pitcher, you have the relief pitcher. It turns out that, you know, in baseball, only about 2% of starting pitchers make it all the way through the game. And that doesn't mean that they're in competition with the starting pitcher. They're all on the same team, right? So we're all on the same team here. So we're not opposing the governor's policy. We're not in competition with the governor's policy. Carbon Washington is simply the relief pitcher for the governor's legislative effort. We're working on a ballot measure campaign. Let me tell you about the strategy that we have. The strategy is we're going to file an initiative to the legislature on March 11, which was last week. And we did. We filed an initiative to the legislature. So in a couple of weeks, we're going to get ballot titles and things like this. And then our goal for the rest of this year until the end of October is to collect 315,000 signatures to get on the ballot. Okay. Actually, there's a step before we get on the ballot. Because it's an initiative to the legislature, it actually goes to the state legislature in January of 2016. State legislature can adopt it, in which case it becomes law, or they can put it on the ballot in November of 2016. So that's the strategy that we're working on. We've raised about $100,000 in the past few months. We've hired co-directors for the campaign, Kyle Murphy and Duncan Clausen, both of whom are here tonight, along with some other folks working on the campaign. And we're moving forward with that. Let me tell you about our policy, because I think it's pretty neat. So it's a BC-style revenue-neutral carbon tax. So there's a carbon tax. It starts at $15 per ton of CO2, goes up to $25 per ton of CO2 the second year, and increases at about 5.5% per year after that in order to maintain revenue neutrality. To put that in terms that may make a little more sense to folks, $25 per ton of CO2 is about 25 cents a gallon of gasoline. It's about 2.5 cents a kilowatt hour of coal-fired power, about half that for natural gas. So that's not nothing. Right? The revenue from the carbon tax, the vast majority of it goes to cut the state sales tax by a full percentage point. That may or may not sound like all that much to you, but nickels and dimes add up over the course of the year. It's hundreds of dollars a year for the average household. And to a first approximation, the impact of this on an average household in Washington state is going to be that households will pay a few $100s more a year for fossil fuels and a few $100s less a year for everything else. Okay? And that's how the revenue-neutral carbon tax works. We do have smaller chunks of the policy. We have $200 million a year to fund the working families rebate, which is a state-level bump-up of the federal earned income tax credit. It's going to provide up to $1,500 a year for 400,000 working families in Washington state. Terrific policy that will address the regressivity, help to address the regressivity of the state tax system. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. We also have a portion of the policy that's going to effectively eliminate the business tax for manufacturers in the state, as a way to address impacts on energy-intensive businesses, especially businesses that are competing with companies in China, in Oregon, in New York, other places in the world that don't have a carbon tax. If you want to see the impact of our proposal on your particular household, then I encourage you to go to the website carbon.cs.washington.edu. We've worked with some folks at the computer science department at the University of Washington, Justin Baer in particular, on a tax swap calculator. It's an independent project, so it's not affiliated with the campaign. What you do is you go and you enter your household income. It estimates how much you'll save from the sales tax, and then you enter how much do you drive, how much gasoline do you buy, how much do you fly, what's your zip code. It figures out who your electric utility is. It estimates what your carbon tax liabilities will be, and at the end, it gives you a number. You're going to save $100, you're going to pay an extra $100, so it actually tells you what the results will be for your particular household. Justin's also working right now on a business calculator, so if you happen to have a business or be involved in a business, we're looking for, Justin and company are looking for folks to test out the business portion of the calculator, so please check that out if you are interested. I'm happy to say that the revenue-neutral carbon tax attracts some bipartisan support, so we have letters of support from economists around the state. We're building support across the political spectrum. I'll give you a couple of examples. Here's what the Seattle Times said. This was in their editorial about the governor's bill, but they wrote that a revenue-neutral approach would be both less financially risky and more politically viable. We're delighted to have an endorsement from Seattle Business Magazine. Here was the issue that, where they issued their endorsement, and what they said was a carbon tax works, and Washington should implement one. The last thing I want to do is touch on a point that I've been repeating of late, which is that it's the idea that carbon taxes are better than you think. So if we go back and think about what things would be like if we were in high school. Right? In high school, maybe carbon taxes would seem to be in line to win the most studious award. Okay, but they probably wouldn't, you wouldn't think that they would be most popular. Right? Carbon taxes have the T word in them. And there are even some folks that argue that they're not going to be most likely to succeed. You occasionally hear an argument that you need, $100 per ton of CO2 in order to really have an impact on carbon emissions. So I want to push back on that and argue that carbon taxes are in fact better than you think in terms of the environmental impact, in terms of the social justice impacts, and in terms of public acceptance. So let's start with the environmental impacts. I think the idea that you need really high carbon tax rates in order to affect behavioral change comes from studies like this one. This is the Energy Information Administration study of transportation. So they looked at a $25 per ton of CO2 carbon tax, again 25 cents a gallon of gasoline. And what you see here is the blue line is business as usual, and the purple line is what you'd get with the carbon tax. Not a whole lot of change according to the EIA model. If you take that same model and apply it to what happened with transportation emissions in British Columbia, this is what you would expect to happen in British Columbia. And as we saw a couple of minutes ago, this is what actually did happen in British Columbia. In other words, carbon taxes are better than you think. And this is actually, this issue has launched a few dissertations about why it is that people seem to be more responsive to price changes than expected. The other point I want to make here, though, is that at least in Washington State, we have a little bit of a distorted view on climate issues because we focus so much on transportation policy. It's important to keep in mind global climate change is a global issue. Transportation emissions are about half of Washington State emissions. They're about a quarter of US emissions. They're about an eighth of global emissions. So nationally, internationally, climate change is not so much about transportation fuels, it's about electricity and it's about coal. And I don't think there's any doubt that a $30 carbon tax or $25 carbon tax is going to have a huge impact on electricity markets and coal in particular. We can even see that from the EIA modeling. Remember that they underestimated the impact of a carbon tax on transportation, but here's their estimate of a carbon tax basically similar to ours, $25 per ton of CO2 going up over time. The line at the top here is business as usual, and this is just for the electricity sector in the United States. The green line is a $25 per ton of CO2 carbon tax going up at 5% a year. Right? Huge, tremendous reductions in electricity emissions. Okay. So I want to turn now to the social justice aspects of it, which come courtesy of this terrific study that just came out from the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy. They actually studied the state and local tax systems in all 50 states, and they broke down the percentage of income for different income groups from the state and local tax system. So for example, here's Oregon. Here's the lowest income group, second, middle, fourth, and then they break the highest income group into 3 different categories, the next 15, the next 4, and then the top 1%. So as you can see in Oregon, more or less everybody pays 7 or 8% of their income in state and local taxes. Okay, so that's Oregon. You want to look at Idaho, roughly similar. You want to look at California. California is a little bit of a higher tax state, so instead of 7 or 8%, it's more like 8 or 9 or 10% even in California. You look at Washington State, here's the Washington State picture. And you actually see similar pictures for other states that have sales taxes and no income taxes. You look at Florida, you look at Tennessee. Washington State happens to have, according to this group, the most regressive state tax system in the country. Okay. Now I want to show you the impact of our policy, okay, on a married couple with 1 child. Essentially what would happen is that. Okay. So we're not really doing a whole lot for the upper ends of the spectrum, okay, but we're significantly reducing the tax burden for the lower ends of the spectrum. Most of that comes because of the working families rebate. So to a first approximation, you can see that you can think of the carbon tax and the sales tax reductions as roughly balancing each other out. And the benefit comes from the working families rebate, which we funded at 25% level relative to the federal earned income tax credit. That's $800 a year for this family that's making $11,000 a year. That's a significant benefit, significant reduction in the regressivity of the state tax system. It's a little more complicated if you think, okay, if you're married and you have more than 1 kid, you actually get a larger benefit. If you're single, you get a smaller benefit. If you don't have kids at all, you get a much smaller benefit. So, the actual impacts per household are going to vary, and you can actually go and look at our calculator tool, and it'll estimate the working families rebate for you or for a household of your choice. But the bottom line is that our policy does a tremendous amount to improve the progressivity or move the tax system in Washington State in a more progressive direction. I'm not going to say that it makes the tax system progressive, but it moves it, it's a solid step in the right direction. The last point I want to touch on is just the public acceptance. There are folks who say, oh, carbon taxes, you could never pass that. You know, the polling is, people aren't going to vote for taxes, things like that. So this was a poll that was actually done by the Gallatin Group here in town and another polling firm, where they basically tested on our policy. Carbon tax, cut the state sales tax, reduce business taxes, etc. And here are the numbers that they got from the statewide poll. Almost 40% support from Republican voters, which is not bad. Okay. 54% overall, which I'll be honest is not great, but it's not terrible. Right? It suggests that we have a chance. And then I want you to notice that of the 18 to 34-year-old age group, over 75% support. And what we're ultimately doing with our policy is heading towards potentially the November 2016 ballot. Lots of young folks are going to come out and vote, and that's part of our strategy, is that we really want to take advantage of that opportunity that's present in 2016. And that's where I want to close with my second baseball metaphor, which is that we want to take a swing at the ball. Somebody told us that we must be in the National League because we're a relief pitcher who wants to take a swing at the ball. Be that as it may, we're determined to take a swing at the ball. We have a lot of exciting stuff going on. I hope you'll come over to our booth afterwards and sign up to be part of our mailing list and get involved in the campaign. We're going to be out gathering signatures starting in a couple of weeks. I hope you'll become part of the effort. And thank you again so much for coming out tonight.
National League, go Cubs. Cubs at the bottom, they rise. You know, I 28 years in radio is a long time. I met Todd and sparred and interviewed back at the Northwest Fish and Forest Initiative when you were at DNR. So Todd's been working on these issues for a long time. He's a member of the Puget Sound Salmon Recovery Council, 15 years experience in environmental politics. He did work at DNR. He's environmental director at the Washington Policy Center, one of the leaders, a national leader on environmental policy. He did work at the Washington State Department of Natural Resources, policy related to old growth protection, spotted owl, forestry regulation. But I think most importantly, he has 2 dogs, a wife, Maria, she counts in there too, and nearly 100,000 honeybees in the foothills of Washington State. So, Todd Myers.
All right, so what I want to talk about is a little bit about my hypothesis about Yoram's graph that shows why it is that a carbon tax works better than you expect. And it sort of reminds me of Reggie Jackson. So I grew up when I was very young in Oakland when they won 3 World Series, 72, 73, 74. I wasn't enough of a baseball fan to appreciate it then, so I'm still waiting for the Mariners. So October, that will occur. But Reggie Jackson, famous home run hitter, was asked one time, he says, you must love facing Nolan Ryan. Nolan Ryan, one of the best fastball pitcher of all time. Power hitters love fastball pitchers. You must love facing Nolan Ryan. And he says, you know, everybody loves ice cream. And I like fastballs just like everybody loves ice cream. You just don't like it when it's being stuffed into you by the gallon. And I think that's what so many of our environmental policies and climate policies, we try to stuff it into people by the gallon. We try to force them to do, here's what you need to do. And it ends up not working very well. But when you say, you know what, I don't really care what you do. If you don't do anything, you're going to pay. But you can do whatever the heck you want. And then you see people go, oh, well, I can do this. And I know I can do this. And after a while, it starts to work really well. If I want to leave you with one message, that's it. That what we need to do is to harness the energy and intelligence of each individual person, because you guys know best what you can do to reduce your carbon footprint better than anybody else. And so much of our problem is that we try to go the Nolan Ryan approach and stuff it into people by the gallon. So I want to talk a little bit about that. So climate, you heard Casey talk about the risk from climate change. But the problem with that is that there is an obligation. The more serious climate change is, the more obliged we are to demand effective policies. And the more quickly we should hold accountable those people who fail to give us effective policies. And yet we don't seem to do that in Washington State. And Seattle is a perfect example. So this is a City of Seattle Climate Action Plan that they adopted, and it says across the nation in 2012 we saw record heat, record drought, superstorms that took significant impact in human tolls. So they're saying we've got to do something. It's a very serious problem. 2012 was also the year that Seattle promised to meet the Kyoto target. So in the late 1990s, there was the Kyoto Protocol, which said that by 2012, countries would reduce their CO2 emissions by 7% compared to 1990. And in 2005, Mayor Nichols said, if George Bush won't do it, I will. I'm going to show you that we can do it, and we're going to be a leader. And so he went out and got the U.S. Conference of Mayors and signed the Climate Protection Agreement, and more than 1,000 cities across the country signed it. And Seattle said, we're going to do this, and here's what happened. Their emissions went up. Emissions went up. And yet we still hear the city of Seattle talk about their leadership role in reducing carbon emissions. What did we learn from this? Has the city of Seattle changed its policies? Was anybody thrown out of office because they promised to reduce carbon emissions and in fact oversaw a city that increased its carbon emissions? Right? If this was Texas, we would say, damn Texans. They don't care. This is Seattle. And yet, what did we do? So if climate change is as serious as the city of Seattle says it is, this is not a record that reflects seriousness. This is a record that reflects wanting to show that you care, but not actually doing things that result in benefits. Cap and trade, I think, has a similarly failed history. And in a lot of ways, cap and trade is positive. It was better than what came before it in the sulfur dioxide market. There were technology mandates and a variety of things, which is why Republicans supported cap and trade as opposed to other things for the sulfur dioxide market. So when I talk about cap and trade, I understand the theory behind it, and I understand it's had some success, but I also think it has some problems, especially when you get on the level of trying to reduce carbon emissions, because things get very expensive and very complicated, and what we need is simple and transparent. Cap and trade is the opposite of that. So let me just give you two examples. One, the Kyoto Protocol in Europe. Europe adopted the Kyoto Protocol. They promised to meet the targets, but just prior to the recession, they were not on track to meet those targets. They were going to miss them. And there was a whole variety of reasons. The biggest one is that as costs started to go up, the political entities started handing out free credits, especially in Germany. Okay? And so they didn't stick with it because it was so complicated. They said, well, we don't want to have these companies go overseas, so we're going to sort of let them off the hook here. And the result is that they were not on target. Now, with the economic recession, everybody's emissions collapsed, and they ended up meeting the target. But what you also see is that the country that had the fastest reductions of CO2 emissions during the 2000s was the United States per capita. Not because we had cap and trade, but because of the recession, but because we moved from coal to natural gas and a variety of things. And so that evidence has been used to make an argument for RGGI, which is the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative in the Northeast, where they have a cap and trade system. And people say, oh, look, prices aren't high there, their economies are growing, cap and trade can work in the United States. But Nate Silver, who's most famous for correctly predicting the 2012 elections, right? All the polls showed that Romney was probably going to win, and he was one of the only guys who said, no, if you look at the numbers, it shows Obama's going to win. So now he does a lot of statistical analysis, and this is from his page where he says, look, compare RGGI to the nation as a whole in terms of carbon emissions reductions. There's no difference. The other thing that we get with cap and trade is it's very volatile in terms of the prices. The prices go up and down, right? We just had a horrible snowpack year this year. The problem with that horrible snowpack year is that we're going to have to replace hydro with natural gas. So our emissions are going to go way up this year. In 2011, we had 140% of average snowpack, and our emissions plummeted. Matter of fact, there were weeks where we used no natural gas electricity in the state at all. That's very rare. So you get these big swings of carbon emissions in Washington state, and you've seen that. That chart is actually from Europe, where it ranged literally from $1 to $45. Okay? So that causes real economic problems, but more importantly, it causes environmental problems. Because if you are facing uncertain prices to produce aluminum or concrete or other energy-intensive things, you're going to avoid that. You're going to get out of Dodge when you see that. Now, we've seen that in Washington state. In 2001, when we had the energy crisis, if you look at carbon emissions in Washington state, you see this drop all of a sudden in 2001. And the reason was not because we did a good job of reducing carbon emissions, it's because we drove some aluminum companies out of the state because energy prices skyrocketed. Was that good for the environment? No. We just produced that aluminum somewhere else, probably where they didn't have hydro. So you have to be very careful with this, because what ends up happening is that you don't reduce emissions, you just displace emissions. That's a real risk of cap and trade. It's what you've seen everywhere. The other thing is that we want to know the future. We want to know what the next cool thing is. And so what we try to do is we try to predict what's going to happen, and we subsidize it, and we say, oh, we're going to subsidize this. Because politicians, they don't want to be left behind. They want to be on the bandwagon. They want to show. So we give subsidies to a variety of things, but a lot of the subsidies we give are to things that are cool, not things that are effective. My latest example du jour is electric vehicles. And let me just say, I'm a car guy. I think the Tesla is about as cool a car as you can get. I want one, badly, okay? I don't have $90,000. Maybe someday, right? My feeling is that electric cars are sort of like cell phones. You know, the first people who had them had the giant brick phone, right? And there was only a few people who had them. And now everybody in the world has one because the technology got cool and the prices came down and everybody has them. I think electric cars are going to do that, but the problem is that we're trying to push people into electric cars, and we're doing subsidies. So right now, Washington state doesn't charge you sales tax if you buy an electric car. And the federal government gives you a rebate. And for a $90,000 car, you get $20,000 in taxpayer subsidies. If you can afford a $90,000 car, should you be getting $20,000 in tax subsidies? No. And if you can afford a $90,000 car, is that $20,000 in subsidies going to change your mind? You're still paying $70,000 for a car. This is the chart up there of where electric cars are in the Washington state, going from the least wealthy zip codes to the most wealthy zip codes. Where are the cars? And the most wealthy zip codes, and yet that's where we're sending all of our taxpayer money. $10 to $15 million every year. Could we do cool stuff with $10 to $15 million? I'm on the Salmon Recovery Council. Walk into the Salmon Recovery Council and say, you know what, I got $10 million. Anybody got any projects? You will be very popular. We don't do that. We give it to people who can afford a Tesla. As much as I like Teslas, they don't need the help. So the question is, does that help the environment? My answer is no, because those people are likely going to buy those cars anyway, because they are cool cars and they have the disposable income to do it. We should put our money elsewhere. But it is politically popular to support electric cars. And so that's the policy that we've come up with. I could rant about green building and solar subsidies, but I won't. I think they're also examples of this same sort of thing where we spend a lot of money and get very tiny environmental benefits for it. So, what is my answer? And this gets to the crux of why I think Yoram's chart makes sense, which is that a distributed problem needs a distributed solution. We hear all the time about making the polluters pay. You know who the polluters are? You. Me. Right? Okay? Everybody. And we're all small, but each of us has the solution that helps us reduce our personal impact in a way that better than anybody else can. And it's going to be different from each of us. And we had to embrace that difference. And we have to have policies that reward that difference, no matter what it is. Right? Some people can afford a Tesla. Some people can carpool. Some people can afford a Prius. Some people can telecommute. When you put a simple price on carbon like a carbon tax, it doesn't matter which one of those you choose. You get rewarded for all of them. That's the great thing about that. And pretty soon you get creative. And you figure out what works. And then it's not being stuffed into you by the gallon. And since I am a beekeeper, I am obliged, since I'm a certified apprentice beekeeper of the Washington State Beekeeper Association, to mention bees at least once in every speech. Here it is. You've heard about colony collapse disorder, about the number of bees that are dying and the hives that are dying. And here's the good thing. What you rarely hear is that we're making progress. It's not getting worse. It's actually getting a lot better. And this is the chart that shows that in about 2006 was when it really peaked. And we got, you can see, the 35% colony loss over the winter. That's bad. On average, before we saw CCD, it was about 18%. So it doubled. Okay? But what you've seen is that steady line down. And it zigs and zags a little bit, but it keeps going down bit by bit. So now we're about to 25%. And the reason, there's no single reason that this has happened. It's because if I don't take care of my bees and reduce all of the various risks on them, I don't get honey. Right? I'm just a hobbyist, but I like honey. And I want more of it. And I can tell you the weird thing is that when people make fun of me about this, is that when you're a beekeeper, you start to really like the bees and you don't even want to squish them. Okay? So imagine now losing 50,000 bees. It's kind of heartbreaking. So beekeepers have found individual ways to reduce the risks, and there's a whole range of risks. But bit by bit, you can see it's coming down and it's getting better. That's the way to do it, with people who know what they're doing, who have an incentive to do it, who are on the ground dealing with it every day. That's the good solution. All right? That's what putting a price on carbon does for you. So, the question is, why would you trust Todd, right? Why would you believe me as opposed to people in Olympia, Washington, D.C., who study this and say, here's the solutions, right? You, like the kitty, are probably giving me the fuzzy eyeball, saying, I'm not sure what this guy's saying. Because what this guy's saying is, let go of control, right? Trust that people will find a way to do it. That's a little unsettling, especially when the threat of climate change is as serious as it is. What I'm saying is, the more serious it is, the less control you want over the solution. Right? That's pretty tough to get around. And so I get a lot of squinty eyes like that when I say things like that. But the fact is, why would we trust Seattle? They tell us all the time how serious it is, and yet they failed. And failure is not a sin. But if you don't learn from it, that's the problem. And I think what we're doing in Seattle is the same old stuff. Because we're trying to do a one-size-fits-all solution when what we need is a distributed solution to a distributed problem. If politicians fail, they aren't held accountable. But if you don't reduce your carbon emissions, you pay the price. You pay a carbon price. There is a personal incentive and a feedback loop so that when you fail, you learn from it and you do better next time. And that's not what we've seen with Seattle and so many other places. So, that's my final message. Don't hope politicians do the right thing. Do the right thing by innovating and acting. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I really was serious about that civil rights foot soldier, Bob Zellner, who I met in Selma, because he did say that this was the most important issue because it affects everybody, and it needs to be approached with justice and equity in mind. Nicole Vallestero Keenan does that. She comes from Puget Sound SAGE. It's a nonprofit that uses research, civic engagement to build equitable and sustainable solutions for some of these problems, some of the most pressing problems in the region. She oversees SAGE's policy and research work and provides policy and data analysis for their labor standards, wage, and environmental justice campaigns. Nicole.
Thank you so much. Okay, so it was just my eyes were at the same level that the really bright light was on that little podium. So let me get into what I do and what I'm going to talk about. So as you know, Puget Sound SAGE is a local regional organization. And the way we approach our work, and this is maybe a thing that Todd and I might agree on, is that people do know what's best for them, but we approach it from the community standpoint. So people in their communities, people in their neighborhoods know what's best for their neighborhoods, and we work with communities to understand how should we approach research, how should we approach policies, and what policies should we advocate for together. And I want to talk a little bit about some of the things we've advocated for and the things we saw the governor put in the Carbon Pollution Accountability Act. So before I start, I need to do a little bit of term defining. Can anyone tell me the difference between these two pictures? And yes, I borrowed this from the web. A lot of people use this picture. You've probably seen it if you do equity work. So anyone in the audience want to tell me the difference between equity and equality? Yeah, and what John Powell at the University of Berkeley calls this is targeted universalism. So you have the same goal, but you have different ways of getting to that goal. And the way you can think about that is, yes, California's policy could be seen as war and peace, but it also has several components within it that address the targeted needs of communities that they've identified and addressed. So when I think of equity and what we think of at SAGE when we talk about equity is we're talking about specific policies that are community generated that responsive governments address. So I also want to talk about something called the climate gap. You hear a lot of people talking about equity nowadays. It seems like something that people are really interested in learning about or engaging with. But I want to talk about what that really means in the context of climate change. So, and I also should probably tell you my personal story because it illuminates why I'm talking about it in this way. So I'm from New Jersey, which if you know anything about New Jersey, it's a whole state whose air quality is in non-attainment levels. I grew up next to an on-ramp to the highway, and the river that was near our house was actually shiny with pollution. So when my mom came down with cancer, the same year I found out that I could not bear children, I had to think it had something to do with where we grew up. So on top of that, I'm Filipino American, and my family lives in New York. So when Typhoon Haiyan hit the same time as Sandy, climate change is a really big deal. And this is the typhoon in the Philippines. I will make things happier by the end, I promise. So the impacts of the climate gap: sea level rise, heat waves, and I want to talk a little bit about pay more for basic necessities. Because right now, as Yoram's chart showed, people with lower incomes and people of color already pay more for basic necessities. And as resources become more scarce, if we don't do something now, we're going to pay even more for basic necessities. Breathe dirtier air and fewer access to jobs. And this is where I'm going to make things happy, is the clean energy economy is something that can really work. I know this from personal stories because when my mom married my stepdad, he worked in solar and paid for me to go to college, and now I'm a policy director, which is pretty awesome. So I want to also talk about what it means in the city of Seattle. So this is the Duwamish. In King County, it has the highest rate of asthma of kids under the age of 5. And over 100 different sources of pollution along the Duwamish River and 5 Superfund sites. And at Puget Sound SAGE, we wanted to understand how do people breathe air differently depending on where you live in the city of Seattle. And so you can see if you live in Georgetown, downtown, or South Park, where there's a lot more traffic, your air quality is literally worse than if you live in Queen Anne. So why does the Carbon Pollution Accountability Act matter for equity, and why does it matter for breathing cleaner air? So what we like about this policy, and when I say we, I mean 30 organizations who are led by people of color across the state, advocated to the governor's office to include equity into the Carbon Pollution Accountability Act. And we're seeing reinvestments in the communities most impacted. And like social cohesion, that sounds like a weird granty word. It kind of is one. It means that if you know your neighbors, if you are in strong bonds with your neighbors, you advocate for things together. When really bad things happen, you have social cohesion to support each other. And that's something that's necessary in every community as we face the impacts of climate change. And economic security. So similar, the reinvestments are invested in the working families tax rebate, but this goes so much beyond just putting a couple $100s into people's pocket. I would love if my own individual actions could change the world, but I know that it's all of our actions bound together with a common goal that actually changes the world. And so if we can insert into structural policies things that change our daily habits, because I know if someone tells me, Nicole, you need to reduce your carbon emissions, I'm like, I don't know what I'd do. Move next door to my job, which I did do. But only because I could actually afford to live in an apartment next to my job because it's a relatively affordable place to live right now. But as people in Seattle in particular are concerned about housing costs going up, we're seeing more and more people being displaced out of the city and having to actually drive and commute into work. Which is why we think the Housing Trust Fund is such an important investment, because it invests in affordable housing to make sure people can actually live near where they work. There's also a fund for transitioning business and protecting jobs. A sustainability count, that actually means it's transit and transportation. And then a lot of money into education. And as we know, our state is in desperate need of putting more money towards education. So that's a little bit about the Carbon Pollution Accountability Act. I want to talk more about where the ideas for this came from so you can see a model of it actually working in California. So what they did after they passed cap and trade, just 2 years ago, California passed an additional bill called SB 535, and it invests 25% of the revenues from carbon pricing into a climate fund. 25% of that benefits disadvantaged communities, 10% directly invested in the communities themselves. And it provides a lot of co-benefits that are really exciting. Cleans up air pollution, improves public health, supports mobility choices, supports economic growth, creates jobs and more. And I'll actually talk about what that looks like. So here's how they spent the money in California. They spent it on community greening, on low-income energy efficiency programs, on renewable energy, on transit operations, transit-oriented development, and clean trucks. So for the folks in Georgetown, South Park, downtown that breathe dirtier air, investment in actually paying for clean trucks is something that is vital. Because right now, the way we just kind of left it to a market solution or individual action where we said, where the Port of Seattle basically claimed that all of the individual truck drivers are independent contractors, so they're not employees. They're responsible for paying for the trucks themselves, but they only make $20 per run. And so if you're making $20 per run, how are you going to afford a $90,000 truck? And so what you often end up seeing is kind of these bottom of the barrel, really dirty trucks. And a fund like this could potentially pay for it. And this is what they did in California. And then they also included a program committee strategy. So they actually had community oversight in how they spent the money. on energy, transportation, freight, affordable housing, and urban forestry. And one of the things that we like about the governor's program is that there's two key equity components in that proposal. The first is environmental justice hotspot mapping. So we actually know which areas of our state are the most polluted, and we can invest in cleaning them up. And the second is an environmental justice oversight committee. So it's a committee of people who are from the identified hotspot areas that actually have a say in how the Department of Ecology incorporates equity into their programs. So I just want to end it on this with my favorite little chart, although I think it should be changed a little bit because I want to specifically name that there's a lot of different ways you can be equitable, and what does equity really mean a lot of the time. When I'm talking about it, I'm talking about specifically race and class. And so sometimes it might be more fair to have some people like in a deep hole, and then some people have like lots of boxes, but this does it for now. All right, thank you very much.
So I would like to talk a little politics before we get into where there's agreement so that we move forward. But I would like to start with a little politics. And Senate Republicans vote on a bill that looks like it has some aspects of climate policy in it, but they debate forever over whether humans can or may be the cause of climate change. The Washington State Senate. I am just curious, each of your honest assessment, and I'll start with you, Casey, because you're there, what is going on, honestly, in the Washington State Senate? Is it money? Is it oil company money making a big play, or are there some honest political debates going on? One or the other, you can't say it's both, but grab that mic.
You know, it is concentrated political and economic influence of the people who don't want this stuff to happen, in a nutshell. And it's wrapped around science, but it's not really around science. I mean, there is no science debate, but as long as they can have one, they win by having it. And the thing that's just kind of sad to me is it's not like solutions aren't at hand. It's not like we could actually, we couldn't make significant headway if we acknowledge the political differences in the form of different philosophies about the role of government and how policy should work and whatnot. But, politics ought to stop at reality's edge.
The governor's bill has in it, 130 major polluters? I forget the number now. Is it 130 major polluters? So, Yoram, that targets the biggest greenhouse gas emitters with a cap and trade. That sounds quick and effective. Why is that having so much trouble in the Washington State Senate?
I think part of the challenge there, I suppose, is, and I'll confess that I'm not an expert on what's going on down in Olympia, but I think part of the challenge is that, yes, you can impose costs on the dirty 130, but a lot of those entities are going to pass costs along to consumers. So part of it is that you have business interests who are lobbying down there, but I think the more legitimate concern is that you are going to see it in higher gas prices and higher electricity prices. And higher
well, we're going to see that no matter what policy, right?
That's true. Yeah. That's why climate policy is hard.
Yeah.
So I think it's important to look at climate policy also as a form of fiscal policy and say, okay, you kind of have to follow the money. And so our particular policy, the carbon Washington approach, is let's try to make folks whole as best we can by cutting sales taxes, cutting business taxes, funding the working families rebate. I think there's an argument to be made that says, hey, we should invest that money in education, transportation, some of the things that Nicole was talking about, but it's a dollar and cents issue. I think that's why it's hard.
Well, Todd, I'm following the money, and I read the reports that the Seattle Times and other papers put out, and they say, oh, look, here's the biggest contributors to these state senators. These are the same ones that are voting to not really, it seems to me, make progress. So are they making progress, and am I being realistic to assess that money is having an effect?
I think if you want to have a bipartisan solution, impugning the motives of your opponent is the stupidest way to start by trying to have a bipartisan solution. I think recognizing that people have a different approach different beliefs about the world is probably a good place to start. I think it's also a good place to start to look at the city of Seattle and their failure. And why don't we ask, who's paying off the city of Seattle? Why is it that they keep doing dumb ideas? Why is it that they keep choosing policies that don't work? We don't seem to ask that question about why it is that Seattle fails and why is it that they choose green building standards when companies like McKinstry give them lots of money, and why is it that they choose other policies that don't work?
You just violated your own precept there, but that's fine. Go ahead.
But you asked me, you implied that, people are doing this because they're being paid off.
I am.
But I suggest that you ask the same thing about the city of Seattle.
I think that's fair.
Okay?
I think that's fair, but
I don't believe either of those things. I mean, I frankly, I've worked in politics a long time, and people don't go through everything that you have to go through in politics. The constant beatings about the head and face with brickbats in the public, simply because somebody gave them a $500 campaign contribution.
11,000, but okay. I hear you. All right, let me come back to that. I want to ask Nicole about, are you done? I don't want to cut you off.
11,000, I don't know what the hell that means, but anyway.
That's how much you got. That's how much some of those guys have gotten. All right, so the same question to you. I mean, what's happening in Olympia? Why is the governor's plan taking so long to either be defeated or get any legs?
Are you asking about the House or the Senate?
I'm asking about how this will shape up, but yes, the Senate is in charge right now.
Okay. Well, to be frank, I've been focusing my energies on the House. And in terms of where it is in the House right now, it's in appropriations. If we see it show up in the budget, we know that it has a good chance of moving forward.
So you think if the House makes progress, the Senate will have to, there will be a compromise that will be more to your liking?
How do I put this?
No or yes.
I think it's like lots more words than no or yes, but most likely no. But the first thing is we need to take action on climate, and we need to take action on climate where equity is maintained through the policy. As it sits right now in the House, there are a lot of equitable components in the policy. I'm a little afraid of what the Senate might do to it, so I'll just put it that way.
All right, well, so let me come back to you. Association of Washington Businesses, your group, other groups in the industry are offering some solutions, but they don't seem to have much meat behind them. What do you think of what's being debated then from the Senate side and the Senate Republicans, and does it move us towards a carbon tax?
Where I think we are with climate policy generally is that it has become a partisan solution. It has become a partisan debate. And I think that is why each side says, what does the other side say? I'm against it. And I think that's unfortunately where we are right now.
Well, so how do we change that? What's the first steps to getting the oil companies and the climate solutions sitting down to compromise on these, what you all laid out as reasonable proposals? So
I think that's why I think a revenue neutral approach makes a lot more sense, because it takes a bunch of issues off the table, right? If you try to do something for everyone, right? You do a $4 billion tax increase that, you know, does this and this and this and this and this. You simply make it very difficult because you add all sorts of complications. A simple revenue neutral approach, I think, works a lot better. And that's why you see guys like Charles Krauthammer, who is not a, you know, leftist, George Shultz, Art Laffer, right, who's the Laffer curve, who's Ronald Reagan's economist, Greg Mankiw, who is George Bush's head of Council of Economics. That's why you see them supporting a revenue neutral approach. Because not only does it address climate policy, it makes sure that we don't send money to our friends in Iran, Venezuela, and Russia too, right, which is also good. I think that's how you do it. And when you add, I mean, like I think what the Senate Democrats tried to do is to say, well, okay, we like this bill, but we're going to make you add a clause that says you believe in climate change. That's about the dumbest thing you can do if you're trying to bring people together. I don't really care why people want to reduce fossil fuel use.
If they're going to do it.
Absolutely.
All right, so what were you wanted to respond to that.
Yeah,
and then
I mean,
Yoram does too, and then Nicole.
all those nice folks that you mentioned with conservative credentials aren't elected officials. If this was so simple and straightforward and bipartisan, how come nobody has even introduced a bill, let alone ever held a vote on one of those kind of bills? I mean, there is no legitimate political space in which somebody is saying, let's have a completely politically diffused, economic textbook policy solution and introduce it into the legislature as a political proposition. Nobody will even introduce that bill. So, the dynamics do get different when you go to the ballot, and I think that's part of why people are talking about ballot initiatives now. But this idea, I think there is this sort of superficial appeal to the idea, well, if we could only get our political philosophies out of the way and just get down to what the economists say, that's not how people work. There's no practical political space there.
Do you want to respond to that notion?
I would just put out there that the legislative route is challenging. I think some of the issues down in Olympia are because of personalities and personality conflicts, and that's part of the reason why our carbon washing group is pushing for a carbon tax. And we think that there's potential for bipartisan common ground. We do think that revenue neutrality is an important part of that, and that's why we're going forward with that.
So I think there's two pieces I want to address in different ways. The first is this idea that something that's simple is the best. In Washington State, we have a very simple sales tax and one of the most aggressive ones in the country. And so I'm not saying I love complexity for the sake of complexity, but if we're really going to address equity, we need targeted solutions that reach the same goal. And so I think it's okay to make a policy slightly more complex if it works better for everyone. Just say that.
You want to make 2 points, right?
Yeah. Now, the second point I want to get at is I think what we're having here behind the scenes, and I'll just try to name it, is a little bit of inside baseball on, I made a baseball metaphor like everyone else, like I'm part of the crowd.
That's your second one.
Yeah. Anyway, sorry, I don't know anything about baseball, but is a little bit of inside baseball in terms of what's the right tactic to make this happen, and so I just want to lay that out there because it seems like some people are nodding because they know. We're having a debate about what's the right tactic and who is our base and who do we want to try to get out there. And so some folks on the left side, which is ironic, are saying that we want to have a bipartisan bill, and so they drafted a bill that they thought that would appeal to some more folks that some of whom are climate deniers, so I'm like, I don't even know why. But, and then on our end, it's thinking about what's a policy that's really going to address people who have the biggest need. Does it do all of that? No, it could be better, but it does have a lot of components that are really important. So I just want to kind of name that because I think it'll make the conversation a little easier to follow.
Well, we'll hold on to that because let me be clear, because it's a philosophy that undergirding this, but we have to get something passed. It is urgent. The argument that Todd and Yoram were making was that there is some equity addressed. Are you saying, what are you saying? Is it not enough equity, or is it not meet any of your goals, a carbon tax?
It's actually, for us, it's not about the mechanism of a carbon tax versus a cap and trade. It's more about incorporating policies that trigger community process. So having community input into what we do with the policy, having community process into how we spend the revenues.
So are you good if the carbon Washington tax is put in place in a year, if we don't get this bill?
There is a whole other bill that I would love to introduce that combines incredible elements from both of them. But I'm not saying that I'm doing that. I'm just saying that's what I would prefer.
All right, well, you'll tell me what those are. Do you think that Yoram's approach is the right approach. Todd, do you support Carbon Washington's approach?
I'm on their advisory board, so. Simple and transparent.
So yes.
That's what I like, yes.
You're gonna vote yes when it comes for the voters.
Yeah, I probably will. Yoram and there is no perfect bill, right? And so Yoram and I have had a couple of discussions about things that I don't like. But yeah, I think it's simple and transparent, and I really like that. And that's what I think works. You know, when Congress, controlled by the Democrats in 2009 in the House and Senate, and we had a Democrat president, and we couldn't do cap and trade while we're talking about obstacles. Kirsten Gillibrand of New York, the state senator or U.S. senator from New York, said that she liked cap and trade, and she wrote a piece in the Wall Street Journal about why cap and trade was good. And her argument was, it's so complex that only Wall Street can figure it out. And this will create a lot of Wall Street jobs. I'm not making this up. Now, if you're a U.S. senator from New York, that's a good argument. Okay? Simple and transparent is better, because the difficult thing, and Yoram pointed this, the difficult thing about a carbon tax is that it's a tax. The great thing about a carbon tax is that it's a tax, because it sends a clear signal to everybody. Look, you don't want to be taxed? Here's how not to be taxed. If you put it in cap and trade and you do all these things to try to hide the political impact, you hide the clarity of the ability to get out of the cost.
Well, let him, before I have a question for you about that, but you don't identify it as a complexity for complexity's sake, I imagine.
So I just started doing my taxes. The only thing more intimidating than War and Peace is the United States tax code.
That's for his argument.
I think there is a, no, it's not. My point being that a tax is not inherently simple. I think there may be some ways to keep a tax simpler. I think there may be a potential edge there. I think it gets overstated to some extent, because an awful lot of the complexity that's in the US tax code, that's in a cap and trade proposal, that's in anything that goes through the meat grinder of legislative politics is a function of a lot of people playing that game who want a cut of the action and who want to affect the outcome of the bill. And that ends up with complicated bills that actually get through things. So whether that's not intrinsic to cap and trade or a carbon tax, that's intrinsic to anything that goes through a legislative body and a democracy that has a lot of very well represented special interests.
Right. I want to ask Yoram something that I want you to respond to, because I'm a little confused about something. Did British Columbia's greenhouse carbon tax reduce their overall emissions to the same extent that a cap and trade system might have?
Yes, depending on where you set the cap.
Well, okay. Yes, depending on where you set the cap.
If you set the cap at the number of emissions that they had with the tax, then the answer is yes.
So then if I set the cap more stringently, don't I get quicker progress?
Potentially. You also potentially get, if you set a cap, then you get certainty about the quantity of emissions. If you set a tax, then you get a certainty about the price of emissions. And so this is an issue that's launched 1,000 dissertations, including my own. I think if you look at the empirical evidence, I mean, the way that economists judge the strength of a carbon pricing policy is to look at the price on carbon. Right? That is the financial incentive that people have to reduce carbon emissions. So in a carbon tax system, it's what's the tax rate. In a cap and trade system, it's what is the permit price for emissions. And British Columbia has $30 per ton of CO2, which is an amazing level for an across-the-board carbon price that covers the whole economy. If you look at cap and trade systems, historically, I'm not saying it has to be this way, historically, they have low prices. California, $12 per ton. Reggie on the East Coast, $4 or $5 per ton. EU ETS in Europe, at least until recently, it was maybe $2 or $3 per ton. So that's how I would judge the strength of a policy, is by looking at the price.
So it is a higher price for a carbon tax on carbon.
In British Columbia, the price on carbon is higher than in many cap and trade systems.
Yes.
It doesn't have to be that way. And I think I agree with what Casey said. You could design a carbon tax in a messed up way that looks like the IRS code. You could design a cap and trade system in a very clear, transparent way. it's in theory, so you can do a lot of those things. I think in practice, you end up with complications. You look at what happened in California. California, turns out, is spending, I think, roughly half of their cap and trade revenue on this high-speed rail between San Francisco and Los Angeles that everybody except the governor seems to be pretty concerned is going to be a boondoggle. I think that I have, as an economist, I have some pretty serious concerns about whether California is going to spend its revenue in a good way. They ended up borrowing a bunch of the revenue to make the general fund whole one year because they needed to balance the budget, so they borrowed carbon pricing revenue. I'm not sure that that's the ideal way to spend carbon pricing revenue.
Why does the governor, Casey, think that a carbon tax is going to be much more expensive in the long run than a cap and trade?
I haven't heard that, so I don't know.
Let's see, $174 a ton by 2025,
okay.
$172 a ton by 2035.
Okay, so that was OFM's analysis of a carbon price. They basically said, and this was part of the governor's task force, they basically said, where would you have to set the carbon price if you did nothing else? If people were totally stupid and didn't respond to economic incentives, if you didn't have any other public policies, how hard would you have to crank on just a carbon price, if that was the only arrow in your quiver, to mix the metaphors, in order to get to the emission reductions that are theoretically state law? And that's the number they came up with. And I think the takeaway from that result is a carbon price isn't the only thing. Nobody said it was the only thing. Even in British Columbia, it's not the only thing. There are other things that are reducing emissions. In California, it's not the only thing. There are other policies. And
what are those policies, either in California or in BC?
In Washington State, we have the Renewable Portfolio Standard that was our Initiative 937. We have building codes. We have clean car standards. We have emission performance standards. All of those things, I think, are good public policies that are having some effect. All of them will work better if we have those two things I outlined at the beginning, a limit on carbon emissions, so we've got a real commitment to get the job done, and when we solve this price problem so that private incentives are aligned with the achievement of those goals. Does that mean that either one of these or any combination of these is the holy grail that replaces all other public policies, and we don't need great programs like Seattle's program, we don't need building codes, we don't need emission standards for cars? No, not at all. And California has a ton of experience with this. Their cap and trade system is part of a bill called AB 32 that included a whole bunch of other stuff, and it's how they work together to solve the problem. I think, anybody who's looking for, a magic bullet that replaces all other climate and clean energy policy and gets the job done purely on the strength of economic incentives, I think is, a little too infatuated with economics. That's not the only thing we're going to do. Or
were you just throwing that down on him?
No, I don't think he thinks that. I think he is too infatuated, but I don't think he thinks we're going to do it all with price.
I think a carbon price is a great place to start, though. And if that's how we can start, especially if we can do it in a bipartisan way, then we should do it. And here's what I will bet my PhD on. Let's get a carbon price of $25 per ton of CO2. You will be super impressed at how much emissions we can reduce in Washington State with that level of a price. It's going to blow out of the water the estimates that came from that study, which I think were not done terribly well. And remember the slides I showed earlier that carbon taxes are better than you think. We can get amazing results with a carbon tax on the order of what the Carbon Washington proposal is talking about.
It'll help.
Okay, so I take it this room is very concerned about whether it's a carbon tax or a cap and trade.
No.
Great, awesome, because I don't care either. I mean,
but you do want to see something done.
And yes, okay. So I guess it's false to say I don't care, because I do care very deeply, but what matters in terms of equity is it's not this policy is equitable, this policy is not equitable. Including equity into any policy involves taking people who are the most impacted, putting them at the center of the debate, and making sure they have power to influence what that policy looks like. Okay, thank you.
And does that happen with a carbon tax as it's currently being proposed?
If we worked together and did a few tweaks, it could, but.
You grab the mic, I think you have something to say.
So there is a reason you should care about the difference between the two, because I think that they can be made to be similar, but I think fundamentally the question is who's the best decision maker and who can make the most effective decisions about reducing carbon. individuals about their own lives or politicians. And given a choice between economics that says if you don't reduce carbon you pay, and politicians, I choose economics. And so the question you asked was, could we set a cap that would do the same thing as what they've done in BC? Theoretically, yes. But the other problem is, let's say you say, okay, well, we can actually do more. We're going to set the cap even more stringent. What happens, right? Don't we get more? The answer is maybe no. We may get less because what you induce are people just leaving. Right? You get more reductions in that jurisdiction, but you may not get more reductions worldwide, right? This is what happened in 2001 when energy prices went way up and aluminum plants just left the state. From a Washington state standpoint, our emissions went down. From a worldwide standpoint, they went up. So that, I think, is sort of the false security of that cap. And I think don't be seduced by that false security, because the tighter you do that cap, the more unintended consequences you induce.
Well, I understand that, and I want to take your questions, but I just want to ask one, and you're going to make comment, but I think you're going to answer this. If we don't have a cap, but we rely on a tax, do we have the tools in our quiver to do all the equity things and to get to that line you had in a timely fashion?
Not yet. And this is a point of really basic philosophical difference, because Todd says, is it better to have individuals or politicians do it? I would put the same question as, are we going to solve this problem individually, or do we need to respond to it collectively? And I think we need an agreement with each other, an understanding with each other about how we're going to solve this problem. If all you do from tonight is go home and screw in your little lonely light bulb, and if you get a little price signal and maybe you'll screw in another one, I don't think any of us believes you can solve a problem at that scale that way. It's a perfect tragedy of the commons problem. We need a common commitment to get this done among individuals, among communities, among nations, because I think actually we're all pretty pumped up and excited about our ability to contribute as individuals, but nobody's really genuinely hopeful about our ability to do what the science says we have to do all around the world unless we figure out how to make a collective commitment to get that done. That's called a cap. It's a law. A law is how we say to each other, we really mean it. We're really going to deliver together on getting this done.
A tax wouldn't do that? Isn't the same thing?
Well, so the interesting, Yoram pointed out that what a tax gives you is certainty on price but not emissions, whereas a cap gives you certainty on emissions but not price. I have to say, from my perspective, from the Vanuatu's perspective, the problem isn't the price of carbon ultimately. The problem is the quantity of carbon. That is what's driving climate change. You know, in a market economy, price and quantity are related, so it's not crazy to talk about price in the context of a good policy discussion about climate. But I think it's also really important to keep our eye on the ball of what we're trying to get done. I don't want the market to decide what quantity of carbon is the right quantity. I want us to decide based on the best science.
All right, let's get some questions before we run out of time. Who wants to ask one? She's going to hold the mic because that gives her the authority.
Awesome. Okay, thank you.
And I think there's a person there too, so raise your hand.
Okay, so this is really a question for all of you. And first of all, don't we already have an incentive to reduce carbon? How much is a couple of more cents on our electricity bills going to actually make a difference? Our incentive is that we're cooking the planet and we're headed for toast, okay? And I want to know, is it really fair to say it should be up to us to make that choice? Because that's been what we've had all along. We do pay for electricity. We do pay less for electricity if we switch to LED bulbs. How is this really going to bring us? There are hard limits on what we can actually keep emitting. And so how do we do that? And so my question is, don't we need laws? I mean, when we started out talking about Selma, okay, did we say here's an economic incentive not to discriminate against people on the basis of the color of their skin? No, we didn't, right? That's my question.
So, don't we need laws?
Don't we need laws?
Do you want to start with that one, Nicole?
So you started off by saying that...
Well, Todd will start.
You started off by saying that we already have an incentive to do this, right? So why haven't we?
You're asking that.
I'm asking you.
Why haven't we responded to the incentives in place now?
Because it's not up to me to decide to build a wind farm, and it's not up to me to decide to build a solar farm. It's not up to me to make all of those choices. The fact is, we have this infrastructure that comes from the fossil fuel industry, and we have a momentum of a snowball rolling downhill of all of the money that they have and all of their incentives that, you know, and all of the funds that are just sort of passively, all the pension funds that are passively invested in these types of industries. And we're all complicit in this, but it doesn't mean that on the individual level, I mean, I could decide to live off the grid, and the futility of that effort would be lost on no one in this room.
So I get you. So you respond, and then Nicole respond, since you asked.
But the fact is, if we wait for everybody to decide that we need to do this because we're worried about the climate, that's why we don't have a policy.
Well, that's why she's saying we need the policy. That's why she's saying we need the cap. We need something in place.
Chicken, meat, egg, right?
I think smokestack meet greenhouse gas emissions. I mean, it's simpler,
but again, if you want to solve that problem, if you're waiting for uniformity of opinion,
yeah,
you are going to wait a very long time.
All right.
Right? We had a cap and trade policy proposed in the Washington State Senate when the Democrats controlled the House and the Senate and Governor Gregoire. We don't have that policy.
All right.
So the only way, the reason I show the chart with the bees, there's no law. There's no law that says we have to reduce colony collapse disorder by this point on this, right? There's no tax even. There is an incentive that says if I lose my hives, I lose money.
But it's so much more personal for you. But I'm not debating this. You go.
Okay, so I just loved your comment about, you know, can we tax people to not discriminate? That just made my day. But how do I put this? I think we are all creatures of habit, and the structures around us form our everyday habits. And so when I lived in far enough away that I had to drive to work, my daily habits produced way more carbon. When I was able to find an affordable place to live next to where I worked, my individual habits changed. Do I think that whether or not I drove 5 miles or walked to work makes a difference to our total greenhouse gas emissions? No, and I think it's a stupid thing to have the conversation focused around what we as individuals do, because it's not going to make a big enough dent. We should curb our own behaviors, but not everyone has the privilege to do so. I had the privilege of being able to live next door, but I couldn't do that. Anyway, so we need policy solutions. We need policy solutions that are informed by community. And I like a lot of the things about your policy, Yoram, to be frank. The thing I don't like about it is that it didn't include a community process to inform what it looks like. And so that's one of my big critiques.
So let me say a couple things. One was, I don't think that Todd is arguing for a laissez-faire approach. I think what Todd is saying is he supports a policy. He supports a revenue-neutral carbon tax policy. So I think there's a distinction between saying, you know, here's some policies I like and here's some policies I don't like, and saying, oh, Todd just thinks we should have laissez-faire and free markets and things will take care of themselves. So I'm worried a little bit about that caricature. Is that reasonable? Yeah. All right. And the other thing I'll say is Carbon Washington has been around for many years. We've talked with many, many folks from lots of different communities in putting our policy together. I think if you look at it, I think you'll find that it's a strong policy. I'm not saying it's a perfect policy is the way that any individual would design it. I think it's a pretty good mix overall.
Yeah, it seems to me like we sort of all bought into the media thing.
Put that mic up a little higher.
We all bought into a media thing of two sides and a fight. And I think the coolest thing that I heard tonight was Yoram saying that he's the pitcher. So I think Yoram and Todd are playing baseball, but I think Nicole and Casey and the governor are playing football. And right now it's football season, and with the legislatures in town, we're trying to get the cap and trade through the legislature. And if that doesn't work, and I think everyone in the room should be helping that happen while that's on the table. And if that doesn't work, then we should all be helping during the when we at the ballot box to get the carbon tax going through, or to get a carbon tax in. So I guess my question is, would all 4 of you work together to support getting something through the legislature? And if that doesn't work, are all 4 of you going to work to support to get something through at the initiative at the ballot box?
I'll just go down the line. You going to work for the governor's plan as a, what, did you use a football metaphor? As football until we enter baseball season?
No, he said it was football season. It's
That's
not
right.
football season.
That's right. But, I mean, is there enough getting us going for you to support the governor's plan?
No, I think the governor's plan is flawed on a whole range of levels.
But I thought in political compromise, we start with what is possible and then we work towards
Why didn't he do a carbon tax? That would have been a political compromise.
All right. What do you say? I can take no, you're not. Are you not lobbying for the governor's?
But it's like, well, why won't you support his? Well, why won't he support mine?
Well, there's an impasse. There's an impasse while the world burns.
I've made my argument about why I think cap and trade is false security.
You did.
So I've made that.
But is there? It's an urgency question. Sir, Yoram, I'll ask you. It's an urgency question, isn't it? I mean, 2016 we're going to have this tax in place. What was 2017? I thought, isn't 2020? I mean, we start running up against the deadline here.
To get back to baseball season, it is not the job of the relief pitcher to criticize the starting pitcher. So what I will say is that the governor's policy is a reasonable policy for to address climate issues. I think it's a heavy lift in the legislature. I wish it the best of luck. I think everybody involved with carbon Washington wishes it the best of luck, and we're focused on our work as the relief pitcher.
So I'd say the answer is no, they're not going to work on that. Are you going to work on the CarbonWA thing?
Oh, are you asking me?
No, he said he supports it.
No,
it's a good idea, but, you know, wish him the best of luck sounds pretty passive to me.
So because I often work in coalition, I can't speak on behalf of any coalition of people. So I just want to say that first. In terms of a little bit of history, we have asked you to work with us, and you said no. So I'm just going to lay that out there.
Carbon Washington?
Yeah.
He's
not
thinking,
under very, very friendly conditions, I'll say.
all right, fair enough. You guys will be working that out later.
I think we should create more friendly conditions. I think what you see in the differences, at least with respect, I mean, Todd has taken a clear stand on the policy merits. I think what you see in the differences here, and the differences in approach and where we're focusing on, are some philosophical differences, some, policy wonky differences, mostly general agreement on what we're trying to accomplish, and some meaningful tactical differences about where we ought to be putting our energy right now. I think it is very important not to accept the conventional wisdom that our legislature, our elected officials, are not capable of doing one of the most important things we're asking them to do. I think we got to not accept any cynicism about that. We've got to go forward and keep asking them to do it and demand that they do it.
So what is that?
But let me talk about the going to the ballot. Do I think for sure? Am I betting my firstborn on them getting it done? No. I think it's. I think we've got a shot, and I think we have to play it for all it's worth. If it doesn't work, I think we should be thinking about a ballot initiative, and I think the important conversation that we're going to need to have, and hopefully get closer on, is what's the best way to win with a good policy that respects, for the most part, the basic criteria that we've laid out for a good policy here, with the possible exception of Todd, are similar.
No, I think Todd's agreeing. I think isn't he with you on a lot of it?
Well, not on, a cap and trade would not be acceptable.
Oh, I see. Okay, yeah.
And I'm not saying that it's absolutely essential. I could see a carbon tax model that could meet our equity goals, that could meet, and there's a lot of good features in this one. I think where we need to do some work together is getting on the same page about what's going to be a policy that genuinely helps a lot, that meets our basic values and commitments about equity, and that we can win. And that doesn't mean that we need to be guaranteed a win in order to go to the ballot, but I think there's some differences of opinion about strategy that we're going to have to close the gap when we're getting done, when the baseball season comes.
Yeah, all right. So I'll ask you this question after we get this last question. That'll be my last question.
Hi. I hope this isn't too much of a side road, but since y'all did mention solar several times, and since you are on the local level, Casey, I've heard that the power companies are actively trying to discourage individual solar use of homes. Is that the case, and is there anything we can do about that?
Yes, that is a side road, but go ahead, you want to answer that?
I actually would like to respond without, I hear the question, and I think that it's a pretty charged one, but you have to think about in terms of what is the purpose of a utility, right? That's a good one. He just said charged. So, you know, the purpose of a utility is to make sure that something that we deem as essential is available to everyone. And when you start to privatize that system, and then some of the folks who utilize solar panels then don't want to pay into the whole system that benefits everyone, you end up having the people with the lowest incomes paying a much higher rate for their products. And I do think that it's important to invest in solar and that people should be encouraged to put solar panels on anything they use, but I do think that we need to think about how do we preserve the utilities that benefit everyone while we transition into cleaner energy sources. That's all I'm saying.
So let me just say this, let me just give you two answers. One, when your son told you to buy carbon offsets, is that right? Yes, that is great, because, no, it's fantastic, because you get the maximum environmental benefit for the smallest amount. Solar has the highest cost per unit of carbon reduction of almost any electric source, right? Wind is better, nuclear is better. Look for the Energy Information Administration and they rank it. Solar is one of the worst ways in terms of getting environmental benefit. But if you want to invest...
Highest cost for environmental benefit.
Highest cost per unit of environmental benefit, right. But if you want to invest in solar, rather than putting it in Seattle, look up cloud solar. So what cloud solar does is that they allow you to invest in solar like you would, but instead of putting the solar panel on your house in Seattle, they put it in Arizona. And you get more energy for the same amount of money. Okay, that's how we need to be doing this, which is where do we get the most environmental bang for the buck? And too often we become enamored with cool technologies like solar or electric cars, and we sort of lose sight of the goal, right? That's George Santayana, right? I'm going to screw up the quote. He is the guy who said if we don't learn from history, we're doomed to repeat it.
Really?
But he also said fanaticism is the art of redoubling your effort when you lost sight of the goal.
Really? I thought you were going to say
keep sight of the goal.
Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. All right, you get one little 30 seconds to respond.
That's Voltaire.
I'm just saying.
You know, bang for the buck, we need a lot of bang. We have to basically eliminate fossil fuel use over the next 35 years. So you can't do that by just saying, oh, what's the cheapest carbon thing I can get right now and let me do that. We have to set the stage for a full transition. All other things being equal, cheap is good, but we have to have a full-scale clean energy revolution. That's going to involve both some cheap stuff that we can do right now and some expensive stuff that's still a little higher up the cost curve. We got to get all that stuff moving.
All right. You know, we could keep going, but we have to get the heck out of here. I think we all know that we have to, some way, inform ourselves and then talk to the mostly Republican majority in the Senate, except for Steve Litzau, who voted the way they did, and see if they want to have a reasonable compromise to get this moving forward.
Talk to the House first. They got some work to do too, your House members.
Okay, we'll talk to them both. Thank you all. Thank you, Sustainable Path.